fires, tornadoes, volcanoes, tidal waves, meteorites. When these kinds of natural phenomena occur, they can be cataclysmic major events, bringing with them staggering loss of human life, tragic environmental devastation, destruction, and hardship. In this sobering yet thrilling installment of Desperate Hours, our special focus is on geological disasters. Now, most natural disasters, including volcanoes and earthquakes, are of course geological disasters. But avalanches, landslides, blizzards, and heat waves, they don't usually cause fatalities in the tens of thousands, do they? Don't be lulled into a false sense of security. While casualty counts might be lower, geological disturbances like landslides and heat waves can cause their fair share of misery. Let's begin with avalanches, the rapid flow of snow down a mountain or hillside. Afghanistan. In some parts of the country, temperatures can soar to 49 degrees Celsius during the summertime. But in the mountains, the snow falls thick and fast. There were 3 chains of avalanches that could be quickly categorized as geological disasters in the first half of this decade, in 2010, 2012, and 2015. The most recent avalanches in 2015 in Afghanistan's Panjshir Valley were virtually in a category of their own. Avalanches some 40 meters high totally submerged homes and entire villages. The hardy mountain people that live in this region had not seen anything as bad in 30 years. Over 280 people were killed, with many more injured and traumatized. As always with avalanches, but particularly in the Panjshir Valley, rescue and aid teams had to reach places not easily accessed at the best of times. It had been the same, if not worse, a few years before, when an avalanche in the northeastern Afghan highlands demolished a village, home to some 200 people. Most of the village was simply caked in snow. The nearest hospital was across a national border in neighboring Tajikistan. This is a place where most travel is either on foot or horseback, though of course there are some four-wheeled vehicles. But nowhere was safe when snow fell in a massive dump from just 40 meters above.
به تعداد 157 شهید انتقال داده شده و تعداد شهدا به می تعداد 157 رسیده. در این 157 135 تن جسد توسط پلیس پروان کشیده شده و متبقی 80 توسط پلیس بغلان به طرف بغلان انتقال داده شده.
Nearby villagers offered what help they could, but outside help only came days after the avalanche, when people from Darwaz district and 25 aid workers from Tajikistan arrived on the scene. In Pakistan, on the 7th of April 2012, an avalanche struck at a military base in the territory around the Siachen Glacier. 140 soldiers and civilian contractors were trapped under deep snow. Hopes were high they'd eventually be saved.
जो अभी टीम्स आई हैं स्विस और जर्मन जो कल पहुंची हैं, उन्होंने भी जाके उसको बाय एंड लार्ज ऑथेंटिकेट किया है कि जिस जगह पे आप डिगिंग कर रहे हैं, बाय एंड लार्ज इट इज़ करेक्ट.
Only on May 29th did authorities officially declare the 129 soldiers and 11 civilian personnel were dead. Nepal is renowned for its mountains, especially Mount Everest, the largest mountain in the world. On Saturday, the 25th of April 2015, an earthquake in Nepal set off an avalanche on Everest, killing dozens. It was all too soon after the tragic events of April 2014, when an avalanche on Everest killed 16 Nepalese guides.
Our 3 members did not come back to that village. Next day we were said that some of our people are missing, and the search was on.
As a mark of respect for the victims, the Sherpa guides announced later that April they would not work on Everest for the remainder of 2014, and they stayed true to their word. Where were you in '62? With any luck, nowhere near Mount Huascaran in northern Peru. Because that's when a tidal wave of snow, ice, and boulders swept down from Peru's highest mountain onto the village below, killing around 3,000 people and displacing thousands more in the region. A few years later, in one of the worst years on record for avalanches, the French ski resort town of Val d'Isère was pounded by a huge wave of snow that killed 42 people in its wake. Unfortunately, avalanches have little respect for human life. Neither does the landslide, another geological phenomenon, one that includes quite a broad spectrum of underground movements, such as rockfalls, the collapse of hillsides and slopes, and shallow debris flows. These can all be considered landslides. They can happen offshore, in coastal and onshore environments. While the scale of destruction from a landslide may sound less dramatic than an avalanche, landslides can also be devastating, not just to the environment, but also to the human spirit, leaving a trail of heartbreak and horror.
Bali, nahihirapan kami dahil sa yung katawan, almost nag-decompose na yung katawan. So, pag-lift namin, yung mababali na yung minsan yung paa, nabali na pag namin.
Ahora cuando llegó la avalancha le pegó, le tumbó la pared de la casa atrás y sacó todo para afuera y nosotros arreglamos muchachos y salimos corriendo.
Who needs an avalanche? It's staggering when you consider the damage caused by landslides alone. Leyte Island in the central Philippines was devastated by a landslide that destroyed an entire village of 2,000 people. The people living around the island's tropical mountain terrain had suspected a landslide or avalanche was imminent. For weeks, they had evacuated their village. But when the heavy rain from a typhoon finally subsided, they returned to their homes. Only days later, tragedy struck. Hundreds buried alive by the slide. The impact was devastating. Huge difficulties were encountered by rescue teams trying to identify where people were buried and in keeping themselves safe, let alone finding survivors.
Mugayad ko nila basig makita nila mga patayng lawas ba. Sa akong pamilya, importante nga akong pamilya ba. Mga didam ko nila nga mugayad ginto, uban ko. Patay buhay uban ko.
On July 30th, 2014, in an Indian village called Malin in the Maharashtra province, around 100 people were killed by a landslide. But was Malin another tragedy that could have been avoided with a little more preparation? Could it have been caused as a result of human action, like farming or road construction? And more than one reporter noted that the village of Malin is only a kilometer or two away from the backwaters of Dimbi Dam, an irrigation project finished in the year 2000. Measured a few days earlier, it had held 250 plus million cubic meters of water. That's a big enough volume of water to make anyone in the neighborhood very uneasy. A year later, in northwest Colombia, it wasn't the folly of man responsible for landslides, but the sheer volume of rain. It was that which was responsible for landslides that killed more than 80 people, with mud rushing into houses and smashing bridges.
La quebrada arrasó con mi hermana, mis sobrinos, y no los hemos podido encontrar. Esta es la hora en que solamente encontraron uno y ellos son 4.
The random cruelty and wanton destructiveness found in nature is truly overwhelming. But geological conditions don't even have to be as obviously destructive as avalanches and landslides to create havoc and heartache. A heat wave can be one of nature's silent killers. India is justifiably renowned for its hot climate, but the heat wave that scorched India in the middle of the decade was something else. The May 2015 heat wave was said to be responsible for 2,500 deaths, making it the second deadliest heat wave in India on record. For 2 miserable weeks, temperatures soared to nearly 45 degrees. In New Delhi, the 45-degree heat actually started melting roads. Day upon day, night after night, of searing temperatures hit the homeless, the elderly, and those who work outside the hardest.
गाड़ियाँ खराब हो रही हैं, ओवरहीट हो रही हैं गाड़ियाँ गर्मी की वजह से, पसीने बार-बार आना, गला सूखना, प्यास लगनी बार-बार, यही जनरली सारी प्रॉब्लम गर्मी में काफ़ी हो रही है.
With the temperature reaching to 47 to 48 degrees Celsius too in some areas. Now the people have been advised through various mediums of communication to take adequate precautions in this regard. Mainly, not to venture out into the open during the hot sun.
But even at nighttime, the heat was stifling. When the monsoon season finally began, a little later than usual, it brought cool and refreshing rains and a welcome drop in temperature. These climatic effects are being felt in the United States as well. From North Dakota to Massachusetts, Washington, D.C. to Chicago, America had a scorcher of a summer in 2013. Temperatures in most U.S. states rose above 32 degrees Celsius, and the humidity certainly didn't help matters. Some people, especially those on vacation, managed to find ways to make the most of the sizzling hot temperatures. but it was no day in the park for practically anyone who had to work outside all day.
105 degrees, stifling heat, sun barreling down on you. Just got to make your money.
The emergency department, we've had, definitely an increase in the number of patients presenting with, heat exhaustion type symptoms, heat cramps, just dehydration, being outside for a little too long, being a little too active outside. We've also had a few patients who've come in with heat stroke, so the most severe form of heat illness.
Of course, there are times when a heat wave is not quite so severe. People in Britain can look back with nostalgia to the lazy, hazy summer days of 1957, when the whole country experienced unusually high temperatures, up to 36 degrees Celsius throughout the entire month of June. Ah, the good old days in the UK, when a swimming costume just meant rolling your trousers up and sunblock meant tying a handkerchief around your head. Even heat waves had better manners in those days, it seems. But geological disasters and disruptions come in all shapes and sizes. Sinkholes must be one of the most curious geological phenomena mankind has ever encountered. A few years ago, in a remote village in Bosnia, the inhabitants were astounded when their local pond disappeared.
Ko ne zna, ja sam došao u petak ujutro 9:30, tek sam onda primijetio, vidio da je otišla velika vrba, nema nigdje, potonula, jezero je nestalo, samo je krater ostao.
These mainly occur in what's called karst terrain, soluble bedrock like limestone or gypsum, which can be dissolved by water. Any hole in the ground which is created by erosion, from a few feet across to the size of a football field, can be considered a sinkhole. Most of them form slowly over time. Others, like the one in Bosnia, can appear suddenly.
I kad znamo kakve su karakteristike jedne i druge formacije, nije čudo što ima ovakva jedna pojava na ovom mjestu, jer ovo nije neuobičajeno da se javlja na kontaktu takve dvije geološke formacije, nije česta.
Some of the villagers, however, insisted on more colorful explanations.
Hasan je umro, ostalo iza njega nakon mjesec i po dana je sve ode. Za njim i tako to. Došlo mu je navodno čiji posle pečenja rakije da očisti vikendicu. Kaže, samo sam primijetila neki vjetar i kaže, kad sam pogledao po jezeru, babo moj po jezeru, u svrtak ide.
In human cost, sinkholes aren't as bad as they look, responsible for just a few isolated fatalities. Blizzards, however, a different animal altogether. A blizzard is a severe snowstorm with winds in excess of 56 kilometers per hour and almost no visibility for more than 3 hours. Blizzards can also occur after snowfall, when high winds cause whiteouts, fallen snow blowing around, and snowdrifts, huge mountains of snow, which decrease visibility. In the US, they've started calling these winter storms Snowmageddon. But winter whiteouts, like the January 2015 Northeast American blizzard, are no laughing matter. Juno, the unofficially named winter storm, was one almighty nor'easter that affected Canada and the central and eastern United States, and eventually parts of Greenland and Western Europe. On January 26, millions of people along the east coast began preparing for heavy snow, powerful winds, and coastal flooding. with a blizzard warning issued for a 400-kilometer stretch of the Northeast, including New York City and Boston. People were expecting the worst, and in many cases, they got it. There were, however, notable exceptions. When Juno finally hit, it wasn't quite with the ferocity expected. Now that said, 83 centimeters of snow fell in parts of northeastern Connecticut. Providence, Rhode Island got 43 centimeters of snow, and Portland, Maine was covered in over a meter of the white stuff. The Boston area was buried in more than 60 centimeters of snow.
I'm guessing there's probably 10 to 12 inches right now on the ground. And it's still coming down about 2 inches an hour, I'd say.
Yeah, we thought we were getting off easy this winter because we haven't had much snow, and all of a sudden we got the big blizzard, and then this, and it sounds like there's some more to come.
And yet New York, which had been bracing itself for the worst, was somehow spared. American meteorologists apologized for their big miss after the Big Apple was largely spared by Juno, with a not unusual January overnight snowfall of around 15 centimeters. With cars banned from the roads and public transport shut down, the city that never sleeps looked like a ghost town. But it's surely better to be safe than sorry. That same year, the holy city of Jerusalem was covered by a resplendent white blanket after the worst snowstorm there in decades. With up to 8 inches of snow piling up in the city and temperatures below freezing, schools and highways were closed.
A storm like that, I don't remember for a long time, and I'm living in Jerusalem for 38 years, and didn't see such a snow.
It was actually the most snow the city had seen since 1879. Jerusalem was brought to a standstill, and at the height of the storm, power cuts left 60,000 homes without electric heating.
For the old people, it's worse. Like for us, it's really fun because we don't get snow, but for old people, I think it's really hard, especially with all the electricity network collapsing and a lot of people got jammed in cars. So luckily, no one died.
Perhaps few people would choose to rhapsodize about the British climate, but actually, most of the time, it's quite mild and temperate. But in 1978, the southern and western parts of the United Kingdom were battered by blizzards and congested by snowdrifts. Many people were trapped in their homes for days. In Yeovilton, in the West Country, the military were called upon to fight with General Winter. Rescue operations were mounted by all 3 branches of the armed services, mainly consisting of dropping off food and supplies and airlifting the seriously injured to hospitals. So there you have it, our dangerous world, where geological mishaps, avalanches, landslides, heat waves, sinkholes and blizzards can spell disaster almost as much as the big cataclysms such as earthquakes, volcanoes, and tidal waves. It's enough to make you want to purchase that one-way ticket to Mars. Catastrophes, cataclysms, calamities. Disasters all, each capable of creating destruction, devastation, and many a desperate hour. Some are natural phenomena, such as tornadoes, volcanoes, and earthquakes. Then there are man-made troubles, such as war, which remind us of man's inhumanity to man. In desperate hours, we stare into the abyss and contemplate these inconvenient truths of life on Earth. In this installment, we batten down the hatches and run for dry land as we look at the damage a little water can do, or rather, a great deal of it. The European Union's flood directive defines a flood as a covering of water of land not normally covered by water. But that rather tepid description simply doesn't do justice to the terror unleashed by raging currents and flash flooding. So then, let's get down to cases. Rio de Janeiro, a place celebrated in song and in the popular imagination for samba and carnival, bronzed beach bodies, and the statue of Christ the Redeemer overlooking it all. Of course, it is also known for its darker side, the grinding poverty of the favela shanty towns, for example. But in January 2011, the state of Rio de Janeiro added flash floods to its global perception. That's when a densely populated region on a steep, hilly area around 40 miles north of the city itself was inundated with torrential rains. This in turn triggered flash floods and mudslides, responsible for hundreds of fatalities.
A água já está na garagem. Eu falei, meu filho, vamos arrumar um jeito de arrolar isso. Ele falou, mãe, vamos embora. O muro já está estourando, larga essa droga para ir.
Esperando passar a tempestade, porque foi como um terremoto, sacudia essa casa toda, sacudia.
Quase que eu me afoguei com ele aqui dentro da água, né? Levei ele para casa do vizinho ali, o vizinho pegou, acolheu nós dois.
The death toll made the January 2011 floods the worst ever single-day natural disaster in Brazil's history. Some of the hardest hit spots were the towns of Teresópolis and Nova Friburgo, where some 300 millimeters of rain fell in the space of just a few hours. Torrential rains come about when a storm system crossing west to east over southern Brazil sucks in a moist southerly flow of air from the Atlantic Ocean. Both rescue and aid workers and environmental building specialists all seem to agree the death toll was needlessly high. The hillside areas around Rio lacked effective early warning systems or community organizations that might have helped residents evacuate as the rains intensified.
Menos 3:30 da manhã e começou a descer pé d'água lá de cima do morro e pessoas pedindo socorro e sem poder fazer nada, cara. A tromba d'água foi incrível.
Foi desastre, ninguém esperava, era rio pequeno, não aparentava ter problema nenhum, de repente causou caos, aniquilou a população. Perdi 23 parentes, perdi meu pai, perdi meu filho.
Weeks after the disaster, many communities remained isolated due to heavy landslides on principal access roads. Dozens of families were thus still dependent on helicopters to deliver emergency health care and essentials like food and potable water. In Teresopolis, the townspeople cleared debris in the streets using shovels and brushes. While in Nova Friburgo, all families could do was watch and cry as their homes were demolished.
Depois dessa lição, eu acho que a fraternidade, o amor, a compaixão vão ser as bases que vão edificar esta nova Friburgo. Com a ajuda de todos, nós vamos reconstruir essa cidade.
January rains in Brazil are becoming increasingly severe, with floods becoming routine. Whether or not the heavy rains can be attributed to climate change, the fact is, urban planning has been weighed down on the Brazilian political agenda for a long time. That doesn't mean things are automatically better in the so-called First World. On the morning of August 29, 2005, Hurricane Katrina hit the Gulf Coast of the United States. The city of New Orleans was one of the most badly affected areas. Technically speaking, although about half of New Orleans is actually above sea level, the Big Easy is completely surrounded by water, and its average elevation, to use the technical term, is about 6 feet below. At different times over the course of the 20th century, the Army Corps of Engineers had built a system of levees and seawalls that were meant to keep the city from flooding. Some of the levees, especially those along the Mississippi River, stood strong in 2005. But those intended to hold back Lake Pontchartrain, Lake Bourne, and the swamps and marshes to the city's east and west were nowhere near as robust. Floodwaters seeped through the soil under some of the levees and swept others away completely. Soon, low-lying places, such as the now infamous 9th Ward, were under so much water, people scrambled to their attics or even rooftops for safety. Mayor Ray Nagin declared that the Superdome, a downtown sports stadium located on relatively high ground, would serve as a shelter of last resort for people who could not leave the city. In effect, that meant the poorest people of New Orleans. Conditions in the overcrowded Superdome were soon less than hygienic, with food and water in short supply. Lawlessness and looting spread throughout the city. The National Guard was mobilized to restore law and order in what quickly became a hostile and unsafe environment. Tensions ran high, and many felt vulnerable.
We could go and help in tsunami, but we can't help our own people. We've been sleeping in the street for 5 days and nights.
If you're sleeping at nighttime, you got a handful of canned goods, people trying to come in and get them. You know, I look at it this way, it's like a battle zone, you know.
Something like 1 million people were made homeless by Katrina, with around 1,200 people drowning in the floodwaters. There was much criticism of the authorities for their handling of the disaster. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, took days to establish operations in New Orleans, and even then did not seem to have a sound plan of action. But criticism went all the way to the highest office in the land.
The country stands with you. We'll do all in our power to help you.
His handling of the disaster left a mark on George Bush's presidential legacy. And in a telling footnote, former New Orleans Mayor Ray Nagin was indicted and imprisoned in 2014 for 20 of 21 charges of wire fraud, bribery, and money laundering, spanning his 2 terms as mayor, including, of course, Katrina. On a certain level, the causes of flooding are easy to wrap your head around. Floods are caused by an imbalance of the hydrological system, the pattern in which water circulates from the clouds to the soil, then to bodies of water such as rivers and oceans, and then back to the clouds. When more water flows through the hydrological system than it has capacity for, then floods are the result. That imbalance is most often the result of torrential rain, with rivers, streams, or reservoirs overflowing due to unusually high rainfall. But also factors such as excess water from melting snow or ice jams in rivers. Essentially, there are 2 types of floods. One is river flooding, where, just as it sounds, water spills over the edges of a river. The other is the flash flood, and is far more dangerous, responsible for the majority of fatalities and large-scale destruction associated with floods. Flash floods occur when a wall of water rapidly sweeps over an area. Another factor causing floods is urbanization. By replacing grass and dirt with concrete, such as buildings, roads, and parking lots, there is insufficient soil to soak up rainwater. When it does overflow, the result is an inconvenience at best, disaster at worst. So rainfall that would be absorbed in a rural area can cause calamity in an urban environment. The need to do something about this problem and threats to the environment in general is something that has slowly but surely gained acceptance worldwide.
Una actitud solamente, lo digo en buen sentido, verde, entre comillas. No es una actitud verde, es mucho más. Es decir, cuidar el ambiente significa una actitud de ecología humana.
But as the old saying goes, fine words butter no parsnips. The race to do something about the melting polar ice caps, which could cause massive flooding, unknown before in recorded history, is like a race against a doomsday clock. We are, potentially, dying by inches.
In these years, it's contributing this much every year to sea level rise. And then you think, well, this is not that much. But if you have 10 years and all of a sudden it's that much, and then you get more global warming perhaps, and it goes faster and faster. And in general, people don't need to be concerned about the Greenland ice sheet because it will be around for a long time. But even if 1/10 of it would melt in the following 100 years, then there will be huge cities, a large share of the population of the world that will get in trouble because of this sea level rise.
Half a century ago, a massive flood affected whole swathes of Germany's coastal regions, and in particular, the city of Hamburg. This was around the time the Beatles were paying their dues in Hamburg's nightclubs, but that's another story.
This is what it looks like, mile upon mile of flood, thousands of homes isolated. With railways underwater and other communications cut, rescue work has been made doubly difficult.
The North Sea flood of 1962 destroyed over 60,000 houses, and the death toll came to 315. Many of the lucky survivors of the North Sea floods would later refer to the military rescue helicopters as the Flying Angels. Interesting to note, this was the first such crisis in Germany since the Second World War in which army personnel and machinery were deployed in such numbers. If you want to define the difference between a disaster and a tragedy, there's an inevitability about a disaster, whereas a tragedy is something that was caused by or could have been avoided were it not for human error. In mid-June of 2013, flash floods and their resulting landslides killed thousands and made many more homeless in the Uttarakhand state and region of northern India. Many of those killed were Hindu pilgrims visiting the Kedarnath shrine. High up in the mountains, it is said that Lord Shiva moved there to be away from the things of man.
हाँ बेटा, कैसे बच्चों के बिना कैसे जाऊं? मेरी तबीयत सही नहीं है।
बाल बच्चा लेकर के रास्ता में है, वो क्या करेगा? हम लोग बहुत तकलीफ में आए।
आप देख ही रहे हैं बाढ़ किसका हिसाब से जो है प्रभावित कर रहा है जनता को।
It was a multi-day cloudburst with driving rain which caused the destructive and lethal floods and landslides. Though other regions of India experienced the flood, and parts of western Nepal and western Tibet were subject to heavy rainfall, the vast majority of the casualties occurred in Uttarakhand. Of course, there wasn't much local officials could have done about the cloudburst. But hundreds of thousands of Hindu pilgrims make the journey to Uttarakhand's temple towns every summer. The hills are also a popular place to go to escape the scorching summer heat. But most tourists leave in July, the start of monsoon season. Only in 2013, the rains started early. Environmental activists said landslides had been made worse due to the unchecked development of the region. Many others complained that the government's relief efforts had been slow and uncoordinated, despite flooding being a regular occurrence.
परेशानी ये है कि पानी के लिए कोई सुविधा नहीं है, खाने वाने भी कुछ भी नहीं आया, टेंट वेंट कुछ भी नहीं, ऐसे रोड पे सामान पड़ा हुआ है हमारा।
मुझे ऐसा लगता है कि कुल सारे प्रयत्नों के बाद भी जितना त्वरित गति से प्रशासकीय ढंग से या शासकीय ढंग से जो काम होना चाहिए संभवतः वो हम लोग नहीं कर पाए। और दूसरी बात है कि पिछले वर्ष के जो दुर्घटना हुई थी उस दुर्घटना से हमने कुछ सीखा ही नहीं, और कुछ सीख करके हमने पिछली बार ही कहा था कि बहुत सी जगह ऐसी हैं कि जहाँ कभी भी क्लाउड बस्ट हो सकता है। ऐसे 233 गांव तो पहले से ही अरमार्क हैं कि जो कभी भी जहाँ कैलेमिटी आ सकती है, आपदा आ सकती है, लेकिन सरकार ने उस ओर ध्यान ही नहीं दिया।
Some 100,000 pilgrims and tourists were trapped for days in the valleys leading to Hindu pilgrimage sites because of the damage done to roads and bridges. On December 26, 2004, millions of people awoke from their post-Christmas Day slumber to horrifying news out of Southeast Asia. It began in the depths of the Indian Ocean with a 9.0 magnitude earthquake. According to the US Geological Survey, the energy it released was equivalent to that of 23,000 Hiroshima-sized atomic bombs. You could be forgiven for thinking of the 2005 tsunami not as an earthquake, but as a series of tidal waves. However, a tsunami is not the same thing as a tidal wave. It's a series of destructive ocean waves triggered by an underwater earthquake, landslide, volcanic eruption, or, we'd better hope, not anytime soon, by the impact of a giant meteor plunging into the sea. But such distinctions wouldn't have seemed very important to anyone caught up in the 2005 tsunami.
Habis gempa itu jam 9 kan? Jam 9 habis gempa ada sekitar 15 menit entah, pas setengah jam lah kan turun air kering.
Rooms filled up within 30 seconds, first of all, to about 3 foot, and then we all got out of the rooms, and then one of our friends has had to go to the hospital. We couldn't get out of the room. He woke up and was asleep on his bed, lying woke up in water. Had to throw the TV through the window to climb out.
Hundreds of thousands were killed in minutes, and millions lost their homes as wave after destructive wave crashed into the coastlines of some 11 Indian Ocean countries. With ruthless efficiency, the waves dragged people out to sea, drowned others on the beach or in their homes, and demolished property on an unimaginable scale. In low-lying areas of western coastal Sumatra, including the city of Banda Aceh, virtually the entire population of 300,000 was affected in one way or another. Aid workers from across the globe rushed to help as soon as they could, but the scale and ferocity of the destruction was overwhelming.
The destruction and the stuff that I've seen here is much more horrific than anything I've seen in combat.
The scale of the 2005 tsunami is still hard to comprehend. A study by the World Bank estimated the cost of the destruction of property and businesses in Sumatra alone at more than $4.4 billion. More than 10 years later, and relief and recovery efforts in affected areas are still ongoing. Rains will fall and riverbanks will burst. But retaining walls can be built, and urban planning should ensure waterways are not blocked, plus drainage systems should be regularly cleared of litter and debris. Natural disasters will be with us for a long time to come. But the death and destruction caused by Brazilian floods and landslides, the flooding after Hurricane Katrina, and the northern Indian floods could all have been reduced by environmental awareness in building codes, better coordinated relief efforts, and so on. Après moi le déluge, or after me the flood, as French King Louis XV once said, in what is seen as the ultimate in irresponsible attitude. It's like so many of the environmental issues that confront us. Prevention will always be better than a cure. floods, fires, tornadoes, volcanoes, tidal waves, meteorites. When these kinds of natural phenomena occur, they can be cataclysmic, major events bringing with them staggering loss of human life, tragic environmental devastation, destruction, and hardship. It's part of being human to be aware of the dangers that are around us all the time. But there's a big difference between doing that and ignoring inconvenient facts or making things worse. After all, life on planet Earth is a fragile enough proposition as it is. So in this rather sobering installment of Desperate Hours, our special focus is on environmental disasters. There are a lot of natural disasters, including volcanoes and earthquakes, that we can't do a great deal about. But there are environmental disasters and disasters in the making that would make sense to prevent, if and while we still can. Let's take the long view for a moment, the view from outer space. It seems we, as a species, are poised on the brink of incredible scientific breakthroughs. This has coincided with climate change, some of it undeniably man-made. The Earth seems to be heading for some kind of tipping point. There have been efforts to turn the ship around. You can go back, for instance, to the Kyoto Protocol, an international agreement to reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases responsible for global warming. In 1997, when the Kyoto Protocol was signed in Japan, the dramatic effects of climate change were already becoming visible in places. The Marshall Islands, for example. Already just an average of 3 meters above sea level, islanders were reporting unusually high tides and sea surges.
The habitable portions of the Marshall Islands and many other island nations could be totally eliminated. Sea level rise actually has the potential to completely wipe out certain societies.
Rising sea levels as a result of the polar ice caps melting are one of the troublesome consequences of climate change. And that year, in Kyoto, delegates spoke of their fears. The resulting agreement to mandate country-by-country reductions in greenhouse gas emissions was ratified by 150 countries, with a notable exception of the US. Developing countries, including China and India, weren't mandated to reduce their emissions, and the protocol didn't even come into effect in some signatory countries for several years. During which time, worldwide greenhouse gas emissions soared by close to 40%. More than enough greenhouse gas to offset any reductions made by the Kyoto countries since 1997. For all its limitations and failures, the Kyoto Protocol was arguably a step in the right direction. Any start is a good start if it is followed through. Just look at the pollution all around us, especially in urban areas, the sheer waste that is part of 21st century life. So before we even get into topics like Amazon deforestation or the South Pacific garbage patch, let's take a hard-eyed look into our own backyards. When trash is left in a landfill, greenhouse gases are released into the air and heavy metals seep into the soil. it's one of the worst things we can do to the environment. It is hardly surprising to learn that in the so-called developing countries, or regions where the infrastructure has been weakened by war and crises, that clean and efficient waste disposal has not been that high on the list of priorities. These scenes of squalor and chaos are from the streets of Beirut in Lebanon. In 2015, mountains of waste like these had become a common sight on Beirut streets. It happened after the city's main landfill was closed and the city's management system was in a state of chaos.
يجب أيضاً إعادة تأهيل المكبات العشوائية المنتشرة في مختلف المناطق اللبنانية والتي يفوق عددها 760 ومع الأسف برمي النفايات في كل مكان في الأسابيع الماضية ربما ارتفع هذا العدد إلى ما يزيد عن.
But we shouldn't sneer, because waste recycling in first world countries often leaves a lot to be desired as well. There are some places, however, where they're trying to make an effort. These days, Sweden is one of few countries which not only incinerate and recycle their own waste, but they actually import household refuse from around Europe and dispose of that too. In 2011, they incinerated around 800,000 tons of trash in Sweden, most of it imported. Only a tiny percent of the country's own garbage is now left in landfills. This has been made possible because of waste-to-energy incinerator plants.
Det är flera steg av rening, vilket gör att vi fångar i stort sett alla tungmetallerna och immobiliserar dem. Vi tar bort dem från miljön och ser till att de aldrig kommer ut i miljön.
Critics of the Swedish recycling effort say the process is not without its dangers, however, and is even, at best, only a localized, short-term solution to a larger global problem. Countries ideally should clean up their own backyards. When it comes to polluting the oceans, where do we begin? The Great Pacific Garbage Patch, also known as the Pacific Trash Vortex. It's a vast gyre of plastic garbage floating in the seas of the North Pacific Ocean. Because it is comprised of untold amounts of debris floating just under the water's surface, its size is hard to estimate. But it's said to cover as much space on a map as the state of Texas. The very existence of the Pacific Trash Vortex is a shameful, hideous blot on the face of our planet. Of course, it did not accumulate overnight, but until recently, nobody seemed to be putting forward any solutions to tidy it up. Then, in 2014, the youngest ever winner of the United Nations Top Global Environmental Prize put forward a plan to rid the ocean of its vast flotillas of plastic garbage. That young scientist was 22-year-old Dutch entrepreneur Boyan Slat, and his plan is to use natural ocean currents and winds to send the plastic along floating barriers into a central recycling point.
We will never be able to clean up every last kilo of plastic, but we're really focusing on the areas where the plastic is most concentrated. And what we've now been able to show that with a single system, in 10 years' time, almost half the Great Pacific Garbage Patch can be cleaned up.
The first cleanup device is expected to be deployed in Japanese waters by 2016. The worst after effects of an environmental catastrophe have all but vanished a decade later. Take the BP oil spill of 2010. The world was aghast at those images of birds and other wildlife completely coated in oil.
Well, she's oiled up. It's a young bird. You can feel the oil. You can feel the oil all over.
An estimated 3.19 million barrels of oil leaked into the Gulf over 3 months in 2010. But just 5 years after the BP oil spill, things for the most part seem to have returned to normal along the Gulf of Mexico.
You'll see that the mangroves here are fairly healthy. You didn't see a lot of dead standing mangrove, not a lot of brown, gray.
The worst might have been over after a decade, but oil spills are obviously not good for the environment and still happen far too often. This oil spill happened in May 2015 off the coast of Santa Barbara, California. It was estimated that around 500 barrels of oil were pumped into the ocean, quite minimal when you think of the BP oil spill. But as marine biologists observed, this was enough to kill hundreds of animals, with a more precise figure hard to calculate, as of course the animals affected dispersed to other parts of the ocean. As well as all the other human activity that impacts the environment, these kinds of accidents just ratchet up the toll on our fragile planet. Last but definitely not least for the different forms of pollution there are, is of course air pollution. These days, if you live in any reasonable sized city, it is something you can hardly fail to notice. But of course, it is in the developing world where cities can rise up seemingly overnight, where pollution is usually at its worst. The Chinese city of Beijing held the top spot as the world's most polluted capital city. That was until recently, when the Indian capital of Delhi took over. This, of course, is a dubious distinction to hold. But the problems of smog and exhaust fumes are hardly limited to China or India. In recent years, Paris, the so-called City of Light, has looked a lot more foggy than it really should.
Un refroidissement nocturne, le sol est très froid, l'atmosphère est chaude. On bloque par un système de couvercle l'ensemble de la pollution est piégée au niveau du sol et du coup les concentrations augmentent.
To combat the fumes, the city has more than once clamped down on driving and parking permits. They also made public transport temporarily free in central Paris. A nice gesture and a sensible move in terms of city management, but a drop in the ocean in terms of the environment, of course. And not all Parisians were impressed, or even that bothered.
Je trouve que c'est un peu dérisoire, comme c'est fait ponctuellement. Maintenant, c'est vrai que je ne m'intéresse pas trop à ce phénomène, mais je trouve que c'est un peu dérisoire.
Carbon monoxide poisoning can of course be lethal, and the #1 source of carbon monoxide comes from exhaust fumes. The race to supplant fossil fuels with an efficient source of clean energy has never been more critically important. Speaking of a race against time, trees and other vegetation in the world's forests soak up heat-trapping carbon dioxide as they grow, helping to cool the planet. When trees are cut down improperly or suffer from drought, they release carbon monoxide into the atmosphere as they rot and die. There was a widespread drought in the Amazon rainforest in 2010 that was even worse than the dry spell of 2005. That at the time was called a once-in-a-century event. Each of the two droughts had a bigger impact on global warming than the entire greenhouse gas output of the United States in 1 year. Right now, the Amazon, the world's largest rainforest, is a bit like an enormous sponge that absorbs carbon emissions and helps cool the planet. Even now, although they are being cleared at an alarming rate, the rainforests of the Amazon still act as the lungs of the planet.
Logging that's taking place there is being exacerbated by climate change. So what we're seeing is this vicious cycle being reinforced of illegal logging, changing weather patterns, rising temperatures, and as a result the Amazon is drying, which is releasing more carbon emissions into the atmosphere. And we really need to put a stop to that. If we don't stop that, we could actually dangerously tilt the climate system.
The Amazon desperately needs to be protected, and this is an issue for the entire world. The world cannot afford to depend on the efforts of crowdfunding campaigns to save the very air that we breathe. The ozone is a stratospheric layer that protects us by absorbing most of the ultraviolet radiation reaching the Earth from the sun. The ozone is being destroyed by certain manufactured chemicals containing either carbon, chlorine, or fluorine. These are the notorious CFCs used in the manufacture of aerosol sprays, solvents, and refrigerants. CFCs can deplete the ozone layer at a disquieting rate with a single molecule of chlorine capable of breaking apart thousands of molecules of ozone. These chemicals have a long lifetime in the atmosphere, meaning most of the CFCs released in the last 80 years are still making their way to the stratosphere, where they will add further to the destruction of the ozone. In 2014, there was news that the Montreal Protocol, which banned the use of CFCs, was starting to show signs of success. We must hope they are right. But meanwhile, make no mistake, mankind has a long way to go if we're going to turn back the tide of climate change and clean up some of the mess created by our presence. In the last decades, there have been some positive signs of progress, but it does seem to be a case of 2 steps backwards for every step forward. In Lima, Peru in 2014, there were protests at the United Nations Climate Change Conference. Activists were furious that UN funds intended to combat climate change were instead being used to build coal-fired power plants.
If you had the choice to invest either in more efficient coal-fired power plants or renewable energy, knowing that by mid-century you have to bring down the CO2 emissions to zero, there's only one answer. You should invest into renewable energies, which will bring also employment into your country, in the countryside, and not only centralized to a few companies.
One of the biggest challenges for legislators worldwide is to divide responsibility for climate change between first world Western countries and emerging economies such as China and India.
有越来越多的经费，越来越多的科学家，甚至越来越多的公众关心空气污染问题，研究空气污染问题，能够找到更好的理解空气污染带来的各种成本，包括健康成本，也包括别的方面的成本，而且更重要的是找到最有效的、 最节省的、最能被大家接受的、最能形成社会共识的改进空气质量的方法、政策，这是我最希望。
It's not difficult to understand why Peruvians would be particularly environmentally conscious. For one thing, Peru's glaciers have lost more than a fifth of their mass in the last 30 years. Bad news for the 30 million people who live along the country's Pacific coastal desert and depend on the glaciers for survival.
Esta agua es para varios usos. El uso principal es la agricultura. Aquí estamos captando agua para poder irrigar 8.000 hectáreas de cultivo, de diferentes tipos de cultivo agrícolas, pero también la utilizamos para generar energía eléctrica. Tenemos una mini central hidroeléctrica, ¿no? Aguas abajo, que nos está generando 3 megavatios de energía, ¿no? Y también tenemos captaciones para el uso de la población.
This could be one of the many consequences of climate change, with glaciers and the polar ice caps melting at an alarming rate. Nowhere is this more apparent than the Antarctic Peninsula, which has seen an increase in temperatures of more than 3 degrees in the last half-century. This may not sound like a lot, but water from the warmer ocean is corroding the ice at the rate of an additional 130 billion tons per year, and the rate is accelerating.
97% of the Antarctic Peninsula is still covered by ice, so it's not that it's all melting, it's all going to go away just like that. But a small amount of that ice melting is enough to make a significant contribution to the water going into the ocean, which makes a significant contribution to sea level rise.
Scientists estimate that it could take between 200 to 1,000 years for the Antarctic Peninsula to melt completely, raising sea levels by as much as 10 feet, with drastic impact on coastal cities.
One of the biggest challenges globally from all of this warming, this melt, is that a lot of the human population lives near sea level. A lot of big cities, a lot of agricultural land, a lot of vulnerable coastline.
Temperatures will rise, as well as sea levels. A recent NASA study on climate change found that 10 of the warmest years between 1880 and 2014 fell between 1998 and 2014, with the year 2014 ranking as the warmest on record. Meanwhile, the region around the North Pole is said to be heating up faster than anywhere else on Earth, with sea ice coverage there shrinking by almost a third in the last 40 years. Furthermore, researchers warn new threats to climate stability are about to be unleashed in the Arctic. Global warming in high latitudes is causing permafrost in Siberia and northern Canada to thaw. This will release plumes of methane, a powerful greenhouse gas, into the atmosphere. These are not simple matters, even for the scientific community. But as custodians of the planet, are we not better to be safe rather than sorry?